All right, guys, back for another digital learning day. We are finishing out World War II today in notes. Going to talk about victory in Europe, victory in Japan, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Hitler killing himself, all that stuff, Battle of the Bulge. So we got a lot on our plate today to finish out World War II. I hope most of you enjoyed your spring break. I'm not sure how many of you guys were able to get away, probably not very many. But you guys have a discussion to finish up after this. It's just a short little discussion, couple of discussion items that you guys are required to contribute to. Um, and you'll just be graded on your contribution to that discussion. And remember, we're talking here on Tuesday, the 31st. So that discussion piece will be due by 11:59 p.m. on April 1st. So let's go ahead and get a few things started here. All right, so here we go. The war ends today. We are finishing things out. VE there stands for victory in Europe. VJ stands for victory in Japan. Those did happen at different times. So a lot of you guys knew that already. You knew what VE and VJ stands for, but just in case you didn't there. So the Third Reich collapses. Germany goes down first here. Last time we talked, we spoke about D-Day in Normandy in 1942, and that was just the beginning. And I would say that the Allies and the Nazi forces were kind of surprised with how quickly the Allied forces advanced through France and Nazi territory once they did reach land on D-Day. The Germans had set up several defenses. And the most significant battle where the Germans tried to launch their kind of one last attempt at an offensive happened in what most people call the Battle of the Bulge. It actually happened in the Ardennes forests between Belgium and Luxembourg. But this was kind of the great battle, last ditch effort by Hitler and the German forces to try to gain back, territory, to try to gain back momentum. And he knew if this did not work, then he was looking at unconditional surrender. So, probably best case scenario, he breaks through the Allied lines here, captures a huge supply area at Antwerp. That was kind of the goal of this. Most people call this battle the Battle of the Bulge, like I said. But really, this was all about supplies. A heavy winter kind of set in, a winter storm hit in the Ardennes mountains or forests around this area. And the biggest thing that Hitler was trying to do was, like I said, maybe gain separate surrenders from the United States and from France, and maybe not looking at unconditional surrender. So, like I said, last ditch effort here. Battle of the Bulge takes place, and the Bulge is in reference to this huge offensive that was kind of directed at one area that Hitler thought was kind of a weak area in the Allied lines. And like I said, conditions were way less than ideal here. Wasn't ideal for the Germans, wasn't ideal for Allied forces. There were United States forces here, there were British forces all on the Allied side, and Hitler kind of throws everything that he can at one area of this line. And like I said, it was a very desperate effort. It was something that he knew had a very small chance of being successful. But at this point, he really has no other option. So there does become this big bulge, or kind of, not a break, but a significant push by the German forces in one area of the Allied lines. And you kind of see the hedgerows here, kind of maybe creating that bulge or that look of the bulge. I'll show you a map here in a second that shows the same thing. But basically, what happened was Hitler was pushed back here. This battle happens at the end of 1944, actually December 1944 into 1945 before it ends. And the big deciding factor was the Allied forces getting reinforcements where German really had no reinforcements to throw at them. So once the air support comes from the Allied forces, and once the tanks roll in, and once some of the reinforcement uh, patrols get there. Actually, one patrol by a U.S. general that's pretty famous, General Patton. That kind of turns the tide, and Hitler gets pushed back. So after that, everything crumbles within a matter of months. Then Hitler kills himself in a bunker while Berlin is being sieged. So he is never captured. He's never caught. Probably did that because a few months earlier, Benito Mussolini from Italy was captured and killed shortly after that, and that led to the Italians surrendering. And maybe Hitler didn't want to go down that same fate, so he decides to take his own life. Um, and that leads us to May 7th, 1945, which we call VE Day, Victory in Europe. That's where most of the European forces, namely the Nazis and the Germans, surrendered, and fighting kind of finishes up in Europe. But that still leaves Japan. Here's a picture I was going to show you the Battle of the Bulge. And you see that big bulge. Look at the blue areas there with the dark blue arrows showing the German forces just trying as best they can to break through that line and cut the Allied line in half. And it just did not happen. They bended, but they did not break, right? So then all the focus turns to Japan, which had huge successes earlier in this war. Even after the United States got involved, there was a lot of like key victories that Japan pulled off in the South Pacific. Um, but one big thing happens in the United States before we even beat Germany, and that is our leader through this entire conflict. Franklin D. Roosevelt dies of a stroke after being the longest tenured president to ever lead the country, and him running for re-elections an unprecedented 2 and 3 times because he felt like we needed this stable leader to lead us through this time of conflict and this time of war. He dies in office, and his vice president, Harry Truman, takes over as president. So we see a change in leadership right in the middle of like maybe the most important time of this war. So as the focus turns to Japan, Harry Truman finally gets to make a lot of huge decisions here. And when we don't even know if Truman was like privy to all the information that was going on behind the scenes while this war was taking place. We know about the nuclear arms race. We knew that the United States had been working on this nuclear bomb, this atomic bomb, and we don't know how much Truman even knew about it before he takes office. But shortly after taking office, he obviously is prepped on it. He's told about it. He's told that the Manhattan Project, which we'll talk about in a second, had came up with this atomic bomb that could be used. That was the most powerful bomb that the world had ever seen, and he, as president of the United States, is now going to have to make the decision on whether he's going to use that bomb or not. And obviously, Truman did not shy away from that decision because he had the sign on his desk that said "the buck stops here." He was kind of famous for having that on the desk, and basically meant like, hey, he was the man in charge. He's the president of the United States. All decisions are made with him. You know, he can't pass the buck to anybody. Basically, is what it's saying. So before we get there, we siege Tokyo. I mean, we bombed Tokyo. We have a big victory at Iwo Jima, and these are all very hard battles. Nothing comes easy in these battles because the Japanese just do not surrender. They would rather die than surrender. Um, a lot of new things that were going on in these battles. Allied forces, for the first time, start dropping napalm, which is this kind of jellied gasoline. It's a term you need to know. It'll become much more popular in the Vietnam War and very controversial in the Vietnam War as well. But just started these huge inferno, powerful fires. I mean, think about just a jellied gasoline, about how much fury that could bring with it. Obviously, super controversial because just the mass destruction that was caused by these napalm bombs that were being dropped in these heavily forested areas. Where Allied forces would, probably not stand a chance very well in hand-to-hand combat and take heavy losses. They decided to use this napalm instead. So Okinawa is invaded as well, and gives the Allies a victory that's very close to Japan to maybe start building up troops for an invasion. I mean, nobody knows what's going to happen at this point. We think that we might have to invade Japan because we have offered at this point only unconditional surrender, and Japan was not agreeing to it. So nobody knows that we have the atomic bomb yet. At least it's not confirmed. I'm sure some behind the channels know about it. But, so the other option is invading Japan. We had to invade Germany when we knew we were going to take heavy losses. Actually, France, right? The German held France. But we didn't know if the same thing was going to happen with Japan. So, looking at Japan here and looking at the vicinity of Okinawa to mainland Japan, we think we might have to start building up some kind of forces or a base to launch an offensive into mainland Japan, which would just be horrific as far as casualties for both sides. So the other option, obviously, is this new technology that had been built. So the Manhattan Project was the code name for this project that was to build an atomic bomb using nuclear power, nuclear weapons. And once we found out the Japanese would not consider unconditional surrender and they would not agree to terms that we asked, us being the allies, like they wanted their emperor to remain in power, even though you can't make demands when we asked for unconditional surrender. So they basically were not agreeing to unconditional surrender. So Truman decides to use atomic weapons for the first time in the history of the world. Um, the Allies threatened Japan with utter and complete destruction. Nobody really knows what that means, right? Like that was just some people thought it was just talk. Well, it wasn't. It was basically saying that we have this weapon that we are about to use, and if you do not surrender, then you're going to see its power and its might. And the Japanese still do not back down. So on August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb named Little Boy is dropped in a wartime situation, killing over 100,000 people pretty much instantly. The Enola Gay was the plane that dropped that, and the havoc that it wreaked was awful, and the death toll, mostly civilians, was awful. And um, a few days later, on August 9th, the second atomic bomb is dropped, codenamed Fat Man, dropped on Nagasaki, Japan, killing about 75,000 people, once again, almost instantly. And at that point, Japan does surrender on August 15th. We know that as VJ Day, Victory in Japan. And Japan is defeated at that point. So World War II officially comes to an end, I guess unofficially, on August 15th. You still have the papers to sign and all that kind of stuff. Um, but here was the big thing, right? Like where do we go now? Building this new world. We know how World War I ended. We know about the 14 points and Woodrow Wilson and self-determination and how that didn't get followed. We know how the League of Nations was pretty much a disaster. We didn't even join it as the United States. So what's going to happen this time? How are things going to be different? Well, the first big difference is on April 25th, 1945, we do create a United Nations, and we set up its charter, which is basically its constitution. And the United Nations is created shortly after the end of World War II. Britain, France, China, Soviet Union, and the United States, all right, we join this time, become permanent members, known as the Security Council, each having a veto power. So, yeah, the International Military Tribune or the Nuremberg trials take place. They put on trial many Nazi war criminals. We know that Hitler can't be tried because he had committed suicide. He was not around, but people like Adolf Eichmann here stood trial for everything that they had done in World War II. So just wanted to finish up with this, and I'll just kind of like let you guys look at this and read it here. Just checking for some understanding here. We're just trying to match up some main terms from the stuff that we covered today in notes. So number one, a constitution would be which one of those three? A hedgerow, a napalm, or a charter? And it would be C, a charter. That's what we talked about with the United Nations. A row of shrubs or trees surrounding a field, often on a dirt wall. And that was shown to you in the picture of the Battle of the Bulge there. That is called a hedgerow. That is A. And then finally, the jellied gasoline that was very controversial that we talked about, that was used in bombs in some of the South Pacific battles, and later on in Vietnam becomes much more popular, is of course B, the one that's left, napalm. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. We will be back at it. There is a discussion that I'm going to point you to now, and it's going to be the next page in your module. Please make a contribution to that discussion. It'll be worth 15 points, and basically just for giving me your opinion. If you have any questions about the lesson, please feel free to add them into that discussion as well.